Binge eating versus emotional eating. They often get thrown around like they're the same thing, but they're not. And this misunderstanding keeps a lot of people stuck because confusing these two can lead you to a wrong solution. If you're treating a binge eating pattern like simple emotional eating, you'll keep spinning your wheels. So today we're going to go into what exactly does binge eating and emotional eating mean? Is emotional eating the same thing as binge eating, and what's the difference between the two? And are there any similarities in the solution to stopping binge eating and emotional eating? First, why does this even matter? Who cares if you're an emotional eater or a binge eater? I had a client, we'll just call her Jenna for today, who came to me convinced that she was just an emotional eater. She didn't think she had a big problem, and that was kind of the label that she'd given herself based on what she knew. So for years, what did she do? She tried all of the classic emotional eating fixes that Google says. Go for a walk when you're stressed out instead of reaching for food. Journal it out, call a friend, and none of it worked. Not because she wasn't trying it enough or she lacked discipline, but because what was actually happening to her late at night when she was alone was she was eating in this like kind of fog where she could barely tell how much she'd eaten or what she'd eaten, and it wasn't really emotional eating. This was something that I felt too is everywhere I looked for advice and information on how to stop overeating was telling me I was an emotional eater. But my experience felt differently than that. It felt much bigger than that. And when you feel like you're in a foggy state and you just eat no matter what emotion is coming up, that's a different experience entirely. And Jenna had no idea because she had never really heard about binge eating before. And most people haven't. Binge eating isn't the most common thing that we talk about. So she just kept blaming herself. She kept thinking that she was failing at something simple, that she should just be able to manage her emotions or do something to distract herself, and it wasn't working. So she kept feeling more and more ashamed every time the just go for a walk advice didn't really work for what she was going through. And I see this all the time. People think that they're just emotional eaters and write it off as no big deal, and then they end up missing a big piece of the puzzle to solving their eating struggle. You stress eat a bag of chips watching TV after a hard day, and you think, oh, maybe this isn't so bad. It's normal. Everyone emotional eats from time to time again. But there might be something deeper going on. So let's go over the differences between the two. Okay, emotional eating. What is it? Emotional eating is when we use food to attempt regulating a feeling. So we can use it for comfort, for soothing, as a distraction, as a reward. And the word attempt here is important because attempting to soothe the emotion is different from actually soothing the emotion. It might feel better temporarily, which is why we do it, is we might feel that little bit of soothing that we want in the moment, but it doesn't really work long term. In fact, most of the times when we emotional eat, we actually end up still feeling that emotion that we didn't want to feel. Plus, now the additional guilt and shame of having just overeaten, plus the physical pain of overeating and the bloating and gas and indigestion, everything that comes with that. So, what does emotional eating look like? It looks like when you're stressed, so you eat something to take the edge off. You're bored at work, and so you eat something to give you a little hit of stimulation. You had a conversation with your partner that was really difficult, so you eat something to soothe yourself after. Or maybe it's celebratory. Something good happened today, and food is how you reward yourself. Emotional eating on its own isn't this pathological thing. It's usually a learned coping tool, something that you picked up young or after a period of immense stress, maybe something that was modeled to you by a parent or caretaker. And so now food has become linked to all of these emotions. Now, it's important to know, though, that emotional eating doesn't exist without some of the factors that often create binge eating, which is where they can kind of go hand in hand. Most people don't just start randomly emotionally eating. There's usually some sort of restriction or dieting or just restriction mindset in general around food that goes along with the emotional eating. What it looks like, though, is when you're emotional eating, it's usually done in a little bit of a slower mannerism. It's not a super large quantity of food. It's like, instead of having one cookie, maybe you had two cookies or three cookies, but it doesn't feel like it was that big of a deal as far as the quantity goes. You generally feel more in control when you're emotional eating versus binge eating. You're pretty conscious about your choice. You know you're not super hungry, but you say, nah, I'm going to have the cookie anyways because I've been really stressed and I'm trying to avoid the thing that is stressing me out. And usually there's not a need to be secretive about emotional eating. Because it's in this smaller quantity, is usually done a little bit slower. People don't have quite as much guilt about it. There might be still a little bit there because it's ultimately not what you want to do, but you don't feel the need to do it in your car away from people or sneaking into the corner of the bathroom in order to do it. So maybe you've identified yourself a little bit in the emotional eating, but for a lot of you here, this isn't the whole story. What's usually happening is a lot more intense than this, and that's where binge eating comes in, which is what we'll get into now. Binge eating is a recognized eating disorder. Now, I'm saying that not to scare you, but to let you know that it is serious and it has a lot of consequences and it's a real thing. You're not just making it up as I can't control myself around food. It is recognized by mental health professionals as an eating disorder. So here's how binge eating is quantified. Binge eating is eating in a discrete period of time, so for example, within 2 hours, any amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in a similar period of time under similar circumstances. Now, that is pretty vague, right? If you're listening to that being like, what does that even mean? Yes, I get that. So let's just think about it practically here. This would be, for example, let's think of a situation, maybe around Christmas time, a normal person might have a cookie or two, and maybe they're emotional eating those cookies or two. But a binge eater will take those package of cookies, sneak them upstairs, and eat the whole thing within 15 minutes. That's like typical binge eating, what it might look like. And it can look a little bit different than that, but that's like what comes to mind for most people when we think about binge eating. It also is accompanied by this sense of lack of control over the eating episode. So there's this feeling that you can't stop eating or control how much one is eating. So those are the two main things that need to happen is eating a larger amount of food than most people would consider normal in that circumstance and that lack of control. Now, how we also quantify binge eating disorder is it's also associated with 3 or more of the following: eating much more rapidly than normal, eating until uncomfortably full, eating large amounts of foods when not physically hungry, eating alone because of being embarrassed by how much you're eating, and finally feeling disgusted with yourself, depressed, or very guilty after overeating. If you have one of those 5 things, that will also put you in the binge eating disorder category. And the final criteria is it needs to be happening at least 1 day a week for 3 months. That will also put you in the binge eating disorder category. So in order for it to be binge eating disorder, those are the things that have to be true. But I think even if one of those is missing for you, like maybe this just started a month ago, that can still be binge eating. And it usually doesn't resolve itself on its own within a month. Most people continue to struggle with binge eating for many years, if not their whole entire life, if they don't get help for it. So for me, in my definition of binge eating, I don't really think it's about the amount of food so much versus how you're eating it that makes it feel like a binge. It's this very trance-like dissociative quality that we have, the shame after, the secrecy around it that makes it be like, okay, this is a binge. It's about the experience while it's happening. Binge eating involves a feeling of this sense of loss of control. You're not actually out of control, but it definitely can feel like it. And it's not this like, I told myself I'd have 1 cookie and I ended up having 2 kind of loss of control. I mean, it is this sense that you are not the one steering the ship. I personally would feel like I was a ghost floating in my body and going somewhere else during those moments. It was almost like I was in a fog or a trance where I would start eating, and then the next clear thought I would have sometimes after would be when I was looking at all the wrappers around me, wondering how I got there. And then there's usually this hard crash into shame, not just a little, oh, probably wasn't a good idea, but it's like this deep shame, a lot of secrecy around it, eating in private, hiding the wrappers, covering up the trash. That's what I would do. Never bringing it up to anyone because it feels so much heavier than I had a stressful day and ate some chips. It starts to feel like evidence that something is actually wrong with you, even though there's nothing wrong with you, I promise. So both binge eating and emotional eating, they do have a lot of crossovers, and usually both of them are done when we're not hungry, right? We're eating food that we don't really need. And being emotionally distressed can lead to bigger binges because our nervous system is dysregulated. So even if we know we're stressed and we're like, I'm okay that I'm stressed, I'm going to manage that stress, we're not necessarily trying to escape it, or we're not trying to escape the boredom. We're like, I'm bored and it's kind of cool. No big deal. Those feelings can be dysregulating to our nervous system, which can make it even more dissociative during the binge. And I would alternate between both of these myself. I had times where I was truly full binge eating 3,000 calories in one sitting. I had times where sometimes I would just eat an extra cookie and I was like, I really didn't need that. Why did I eat that? Confused about really just why I was eating so much food in general versus like what type of eater am I? But here's why I made this whole episode about this definition. Because if you don't know which one of these you're actually dealing with, you're going to keep reaching for the wrong tool and then blaming yourself when it doesn't work. If what you're experiencing is more on the emotional eating side, things like noticing and allowing the urge, building in a pause, finding other ways to meet that need. So if you're bored, finding an activity, for example, those approaches can genuinely help. They're working with the actual mechanism of what's happening. If you're experiencing that loss of control, fogginess, dissociative kind of eating, those same tools are going to fall flat. Not because you're doing them wrong or there's something broken about you, but because they weren't built for what's actually happening in your brain and body during a binge. You can't just journal your way out of a trance state. We need something different for that. And I really wanted to build up the awareness around what binge eating is, because I think sometimes we don't want to take on that identity, that label. Like there's a lot of shame around saying I'm a binge eater. And you don't have to make that necessarily who you are, but it is important to know that this is serious and this is something that majorly impacts your life. And it's not as simple as, oh, I just need to call a friend when I have a binge urge. This is exactly what kept my client Jenna stuck for so long. She kept using emotional eating tools on a binge eating pattern, and every time that it didn't work, she added that to the pile of evidence that she was the problem, that she just didn't have enough willpower, discipline, enough whatever. When really what she just needed was a completely different approach, one that actually addressed what was happening in her brain in those moments of loss of control, not just the feeling underneath it. This is the kind of thing I go really deep into inside my Confident Eater program. So whether you are emotional eating or binge eating, I do address both patterns. I have tools for both. And when I work with clients one-on-one, I help them figure out their specific pattern and give them these research-backed tools that will actually interrupt the binge habit before it takes over. So if you've spent years calling yourself just an emotional eater or wondering if you're even bad enough to call what you do binge eating, I hope this gave you some clarity and insights today. You're not broken, you're not making this up. There is an actual reason why this has felt so hard to fix, and now you know more about why that is.